What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. It's Thursday, which means it's time for our weekly redraft. We started in 2020. We went all the way down to 2012 last week. So today we have the 2011 draft. And this is a pretty fantastic draft. In my opinion, probably like the best top 10, maybe even over 2015. Not a McDavid level player, but basically none of these guys busted. The two worst guys are Ryan Strome, who's still a pretty decent NHLer, and Adam Larson, and basically everybody else has been a very good NHLer at one point. It goes Nuge, Landeskog, Huberdeau, Larson, Strome, Zibanejad, Scheifele, Couturier, Hamilton, and Brodin. So we have our work cut out for us. A lot of those guys are going to stay in the top 10. I think you guys, if you are aware of this draft, you know who's going to be number one, but basically two through 9 beyond that, it can go a bunch of different ways. This was the hardest one that I've ever done. There is not, usually we have like a clear 1 and 2, then like 3 through 5 is the same tier, 6 through 9 is the same tier, and then 10 is whatever. This is going to be really hard. You guys, rightfully so, probably will be commenting in different order. Let me know in the comments what you think your order would be compared to mine. But without further ado, let's knock out the easiest one first. Kucherov goes first overall to the Edmonton Oilers instead of Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. This clearly the number one pick when looking at Kucherov, one-time Hart winner this year, could potentially be a finalist. Since that 2019 Hart winning season, he's put up 502 points in 343 games, which is 40 goal, 80 assist, 120 point pace. In terms of offensive production, he's been a no doubt top 3 player in the last 5 years. Just so fantastic. One of the best playmakers that I've ever seen in my entire life. Probably definitely going to go down as a top 50 player of all time, arguably top 40 given his postseason success, as well as the fact that he does have that Hart Trophy and is going to finish well north of probably 1,200 career points. Kucherov's first overall pick here. Edmonton was still really in the dark days of their rebuild, getting Taylor Hall in 2010. So they get Kucherov. They have a good future going forward. Will they end up getting McDavid as a result? Who knows? But right now we're looking at 2011 isolated, and Kucherov is the pick. Next up at second overall, this is when we start getting controversial. I have JT Miller going second overall to the Avalanche instead of Gabriel Landeskog. When looking at JT Miller, he definitely blossomed late until he was like 25, 26, but he was a solid player in New York and Tampa. He was around a 55 to 60 point guy. It's not like it was completely like a Tage Thompson literally out of nowhere. No, he was a very good second liner, low end first liner. And then obviously since he got to Vancouver, he's basically been point per game every single year, including 2 years ago when Colorado would have won the Stanley Cup. He had 99 points. This year, probably going to go north of 87 points in 67 games. So when looking at him, I think he's probably the second best player in the NHL right now, as well as having a solid track record before. The last 4 years has been a no doubt probably top 50, top 40 player in the entire NHL. Again, I can see other guys having arguments, but right now I'm going to go with JT Miller, especially considering the Colorado Avalanche, the way their rebuild went, ended up taking Landeskog. They weren't really a high-end contender until 2019, until 2020 when Cale Makar debuted. They had that one season in 2014, but then that was kind of it. So when looking at it, a guy like JT Miller that did blossom a little bit later, I think it fits with the Avalanche's timeline. Their contender window has been basically 2019 to 2024 and going forward, and JT Miller was a point per game player for most of that and is now like 100 goddamn points. Third overall, the Panthers initially took Jonathan Huberdeau. I have them taking Mark Scheifele. Now, I can see an argument for Scheifele at second overall, considering Scheifele was that point per game guy earlier in 2017. He's basically been around point per game every single year since then. Hasn't had the high highs of JT Miller, which is why I kind of went with JT Miller. But yeah, every single year for the most part, he's been point per game besides last year when he only had 68 points, but he had 42 goals, so that kind of made up for it. He's been just a consistent 35 goal, 45 assist kind of player, top 13 to 17 center in the entire NHL. Again, he's never really had that insane season, but when looking at him, and then eventually they get Barkov, which they were the worst team in the entire NHL in 2013. Scheifele wasn't even a full-time NHLer until 2014, so they probably would have still got Barkov at second overall, and that would have been the best, arguably, probably the best center duo besides, in this Leon Draisaitl McDavid doesn't happen, but they would have the best center duo of 2018 on for the most part. Scheifele and Barkov would have been fantastic. So they take Mark Scheifele. Fourth overall, the Devils initially took Adam Larson. I had them taking a defenseman in Dougie Hamilton. Now, Dougie Hamilton's injury definitely complicates this a little bit. You could argue him second or third if he didn't get hurt this year and had another 74-point season. I don't think that this is going to be a horrible injury for him. He just tore his pec. It's not like Gabriel Landeskog, who we're going to get to, had knee cartilage surgery that could threaten his entire career. But when looking at Dougie Hamilton, he was a very good top pairing guy in Calgary. And basically from Once he arrived in Carolina up until last season when I think he finished like top 5 in Norris. He's been a top 10 defenseman for the most part in the entire NHL. Definitely more of an offensive guy, but in those 5 years, he put up 202 points in 266 games, good for 62-point pace. So he's a fantastic number one offensive defenseman. Yes, he does need to play with like Siegenthaler to kind of maybe hide some of his defensive warts, but he's just so good offensively. I think considering how long he's been doing it for, the Devils make sense at 4th overall for him. 5th overall, this is a little bit funny, but I have Zibanejad going to the New York Islanders instead of Ryan Strome. Obviously, Ryan Strome didn't really work out. It kind of worked out because they ended up trading Jordan Eberle for him. But when looking at Zibanejad, he also, similarly to a JT Miller, did take some time to develop. It wasn't really until his 3rd season with the Rangers that he really broke out. Before that, he was a solid around 50-point guy. There's a reason why they traded him for like Brassard in a second. Brassard seemed like a much better player, but since then he's been very good, especially after that one 2020 season before the COVID shutdown. He had 41 goals in 59 games, and since then he's been around 80, 90 points, similarly to Scheifele, a top 13 to 17 center in the entire NHL. So when looking at the New York Islanders, I think he would have been a very nice second line center to John Tavares in the late 2010s. And then beyond that, him and Barzal would have been a very good center duo pair. So I think the Islanders at 5th overall makes a lot of sense. At 6th overall, a little bit of a controversial pick, but I'm going to go with Johnny Gaudreau instead of Zibanejad, who went 6th overall to the Ottawa Senators. Gaudreau 2 years ago probably would have been top 3 on this entire thing, coming off 115 or 116 point season, but obviously his play has deteriorated. I think his play gets shit on a little bit more just because he gets paid so much. Last year he had 74 points. This year a very disappointing 45 and 65. But in this guy's prime, 2 seasons he finished 4th in the goddamn Hart when he had that 115, and then in 2019 he had 99 points. He was an elite top 30, top 40 player in the entire NHL. So although of late, definitely there's some guys that I'm going to list off later in this list that are better right now than a Gaudreau, you cannot deny that for between the ages of 23 up until 30, he was one of the best wingers in the entire NHL. And I think even going forward, if he wasn't on the Columbus Blue Jackets that absolutely suck, he would probably be a 65 to 70 point guy if he actually had competent center play for the most part. You replace him with the guy that I have at 8th overall, he'd be putting up much better numbers. It's kind of just a victim of his circumstance, but he has regressed a decent amount. So as a result, I got to have him at 6th. 7th, the Jets take Jonathan Huberdeau instead of Mark Scheifele. Similarly to Gaudreau, 2 years ago, he'd also be probably top 3. He'd probably go Kucherov, Gaudreau, and Huberdeau. Take your pick, but he has fallen off even more to a degree when looking at him. His 4-year prime was insane, though. 346 points in 286 games. Good for 99-point pace, obviously highlighted by that 116-point season. But it has been very disappointing of late. 56 points last year, on pace for 52 points right now. But again, it's basically the same thing with Gaudreau. He was fantastic in his prime. He was one of the best left wingers in the entire NHL, and I think he would be doing better on a better a better team overall. And when looking at the Winnipeg Jets, I think this is a good fit considering the Winnipeg Jets were a very competitive team from 2017 on. And I think Jonathan Huberdeau, that's really when he started to hit his stride in 2017. So in terms of a team fit, I like Jonathan Huberdeau heading to the Winnipeg Jets. 8th overall, the Flyers initially took Sean Couturier. I have them taking Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. Now, Nugent-Hopkins is definitely better right now than, my hair keeps on flopping over. Right now, no doubt better than Johnny Gaudreau and Jonathan Huberdeau, but overall, do I think that he's had the better career? No, he was mainly just a secondary piece up until last year when he had 104 points, but even last year was basically all on the power play. He's a very good second piece. He's a very good second wingman to a potential number 1 center, number 1 winger. So when looking at Nugent-Hopkins, I think he goes 8th to the Philadelphia Flyers, even though he might be better going forward than Gaudreau and Huberdeau. Their primes were just so much better. I know he had 104 points, greatest power play of all time, but their primes, they were actual superstar difference makers. I don't think Nuge really has that upside, and it did take him a while to even become around the 70-ish point player. So I think he goes to the Flyers, where he forms a pretty decent duo with Claude Giroux. Would be interesting to see how that goes if Philly goes on a run in the mid to late 2010s, because Nuge was a good player right out of the gate. I have him going 8th. 9th, Gabriel Landeskog to the Boston Bruins. Now, Landeskog, of course, is a very interesting, very controversial pick maybe in this. Some people might have him higher. I'm not as optimistic as others in terms of his return. Knee cartilage surgery is, besides like a paralyzation or like obviously like losing a goddamn leg, it is about as bad in terms of his surgery. Your knee cartilage is not something that can be easily repaired. He had to get a knee cartilage surgery. Other guys that dealt with this is Lonzo Ball, who still has not played basketball. Last game was January of 2022. I believe Mark Mathot also dealt with it, ended his career, but Mark Mathot obviously wasn't as good as Gabriel Landeskog. So in looking at Landeskog, I think if he does return, he's going to be 60 to 70% of the player that he was. But in terms of the Boston Bruins, I do think this fit does make sense for Landeskog, considering they were highly competitive from 2012, the 2012 season, all the way up until 2022 when Landeskog played, when he was a fantastic player. His 4-year prime was him having 105 goals, 125 assists for 230 points in 232 games, on pace for 37 goals, 44 assists, 81 points. Now that was with McKinnon and Rantanen being their third, kind of the third option on that line, but still, he was a fantastic player. And looking at the Boston Bruins, I think he'd slot very nicely on that second line. They wouldn't be as reliant on the perfection line to kind of not carry them. They did have some forward depth, but they were really relying on them in the late 2010s, early 2020s. So having a guy like Landeskog balance out their roster would have been very good for them. I understand maybe having Landeskog a little bit higher, but when looking at him overall, it's tough just given that injury. I can't have him that high. 10th overall, and finally, we got Brodin that initially went to the Minnesota Wild at 10th overall, and I'm keeping him there. He has been probably the most underrated defenseman of the entire 2010s, 2020s, definitely the late 2010s. When looking at him, basically every single year, he's been in the top 5, top 3 percentile in terms of defenseman. Doesn't have that high offensive upside, but he's been a top, for his prime, like a top 25 to 35 defenseman in the entire NHL. He's basically Jacob Slavin, just like 10, 15 less points a season. He's just so fantastic defensively. I think he's been the unsung hero of Minnesota's regular season success. Obviously, they've not really got it done in the playoffs during his tenure, but I think he's a fantastic player. Now, in terms of honorable mentions, almost put Vincent Trocheck. He's been a little bit too much yo-yo up and down in his career, but when he's on, he's really, really good. I could see you taking him 10th overall to the Minnesota Wild. Sean Couturier hasn't been the same player since getting back from injury after having back-to-back surgeries. Just not looking like the same player. If he never had that injury, he definitely would have been on this, definitely over Brodin, probably 9th, probably 8th. Boone Jenner, that doesn't really have that upside. William Karlsson, maybe you could argue at 10. Philip Deneau, John Gibson, and Ricard Raquel. I like my list. Maybe Trocheck at 10th overall you can make an argument for. But besides that, here's the final. Kucherov, Miller, Scheifele, Hamilton, Zibanejad, Gaudreau, Huberdeau, Nugent-Hopkins, Landeskog, and Brodin. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about this? Again, this is razor close in terms of 2 through 9. You can make an argument for a lot of guys, and I'll be seeing the next one.